The Duke returned home, but he wasn't alone.
She has nowhere else to go. An heir, Isabella.
She's dripping on the carpet, Arthur.
With a wet crunch against the gravel, the carriage wheels ground to a halt. Her husband hadn't returned alone, bringing with him a girl with mud on her hem and a heavy, undeniable swell beneath her wool coat. Rather than screaming, Isabella simply stared at her boots and thought about the Albusan rugs. The library smelled of beeswax, damp ash, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron gall ink. Isabella had been sitting at the mahogany desk for 4 hours. Her fingers were stiff, smudged black at the tips, resting on the open ledger of the Westford estate. The numbers were a disaster. They were always a disaster. Arthur had a talent for buying thoroughbreds that snapped their legs and investing in shipping routes that only existed on optimistic maps. When the heavy oak doors opened, the draft hit her first, smelling of November rain and wet horse. Isabella. Arthur stood in the doorway. He looked tired, not the noble exhaustion of a man who had been working, but the petulant fatigue of a boy who had been caught out in the rain. Water dripped from the brim of his hat, and then she stepped out from behind him. She was young. That was the first thing that registered, hitting Isabella with a dull, hollow thud rather than a sharp stab. 19, perhaps. 20. Her blonde hair was plastered to her cheeks, and she was shivering. She smelled faintly of cheap lavender water masking the sour scent of nervous sweat. But it was her silhouette that drew the eye. Even under the thick, sodden layers of her traveling cloak, the protrusion of her belly was unmistakable. 6 months, at least. Isabella didn't stand up. She didn't throw the inkwell. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the ragged, shallow breaths the girl was taking. "This is Abigail," Arthur said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, aiming for authority and landing somewhere near pleading. She has nowhere else to go, Isabella. The lodging house turned her out. It's winter. Isabella looked at Abigail. The girl wouldn't meet her eyes. She stared at the clawed feet of the desk. Her hands were gloveless, raw and red from the cold, and Isabella noticed the cuticles were chewed down to the quick, blood on one of the thumbs. "She is carrying a child," Isabella said. Her voice sounded detached, like it was coming from the other side of the room. "My child," Arthur said. He stepped closer to her, a protective, pathetic little half-step. "An heir. Isabella, you know we haven't. You know the doctors said it was unlikely for us." There it was, the justification, the weak man's armor. Isabella felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea, thick and hot in the back of her throat. She swallowed it down. She looked from Arthur's flushed, defensive face to the girl's trembling shoulders. The urge to rage, to tear at her hair and curse him to hell, simply wasn't there. Instead, there was a cold, creeping realization settling into her bones. "She is dripping on the carpet, Arthur," Isabella said quietly. Arthur blinked, thrown entirely off balance by the mundane observation. "What?" "The rug. It is French. It costs £300. Have Mrs. Higgins take her to the East Wing. The blue room has a fireplace." Isabella finally stood, carefully closing the heavy leather cover of the ledger. "I will speak with you in the drawing room. Give her to the housekeeper." She walked past them. She didn't look at the girl again, but as she passed, she felt the radiating heat of her body, the undeniable, vibrant life standing in the middle of her dying, bankrupt house. Her chest felt tight, bound by iron bands, but she kept her spine rigidly straight. In the drawing room, Isabella poured a glass of sherry. Her hand shook just enough to clink the crystal decanter against the rim. She drank it fast, letting the burn distract her from the frantic racing of her heart. When Arthur entered, he looked like a man walking to the gallows. He poured his own drink, a generous measure of brandy, and downed it in one gulp. "It was an accident," he began. The eternal refrain of the careless. A mistake. In London, during the spring season. I was lonely. Isabella. You are always here, buried in your books, managing the tenants. Because if I do not manage the tenants, Arthur, we do not eat, Isabella interrupted, her tone flat. Your father left this estate mortgaged to the hilt. My dowry kept the roof from caving in. My ledgers keep the creditors from the door. He flushed. His pride stung. I am the Duke of Westford. I will not be spoken to like a clerk. Then do not act like a vagrant, Isabella snapped, the anger finally flaring, hot and bright. You bring a pregnant whore into my home. Do not call her that, he shouted, slamming his glass down on the side table. The crystal shattered. Shards of glass and amber liquid scattered across the polished oak. They stared at the mess. Arthur deflated, running a hand over his face. She is a good girl, Isabella. A shop girl. She didn't ask for this. I couldn't leave her in the squalor. Not with my child. My son. You don't know it's a son, Isabella said. I feel it, he said, and the earnestness in his voice made her want to hit him. I know this is an insult to you, but I ask you to bear it. For the sake of the family name, we can raise the child here. She will be quiet. When the baby is born, we can make arrangements. He was rambling. He had no plan. He never had a plan. He lived entirely in the present moment, driven by impulse and relying on others to clean up the wreckage. Usually, that someone was Isabella. You want me to house your mistress, she said, clarifying the absurdity of it. To feed her, under my roof, while she swells with your bastard. And then what? Pass the child off as a ward. Adopt it? It has been done before, Arthur muttered, looking at the floor. She looked at him. She looked at the man she had married 5 years ago. He had been handsome then, charming in a boyish way. Now, the charm was worn thin, revealing the cowardice beneath. He wasn't a monster. That was the tragedy of it. If he were a monster, it would be easier to hate him. He was just profoundly, destructively weak. Clean up the glass, Arthur, Isabella said, turning toward the door, before someone cuts their foot. But Isabella didn't sleep that night. She lay in the massive 4-poster bed, staring at the canopy. The house was dead silent, but in her mind, she could hear the creak of floorboards in the east wing. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, trying to massage away the ache. The humiliation tasted like copper on her tongue. He had brought her here. He had forced her to look at the living consequence of her own failure to provide an heir. But as the hours ticked by, the humiliation curdled into something else, something harder. The next 2 weeks were a study in agonizing, surreal domesticity. Abigail did not stay in her room. Arthur had insisted she needed mild exercise for her constitution. So, she wandered. Isabella would find her in the conservatory, staring blankly at the dying ferns. She would pass her in the corridors, her heavy footsteps shuffling against the hardwood. She was terrified of Isabella. Whenever Isabella entered a room, she would freeze, her pale blue eyes going wide, like a rabbit spotting a hound. She tried to make herself small, which was a physical impossibility given her condition. They had dinner together, the 3 of them. It was Arthur's grand idea of civilized integration. The dining room was a cavernous space meant for 30, but they sat clustered at one end of the long mahogany table. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates sounded like gunshots. The soup is excellent, Arthur offered into the silence, his eyes darting between Isabella and Abigail. Isabella took a slow sip of her wine. It was a cheap Bordeaux. They couldn't afford the good vintages anymore. It is mutton broth, Arthur. It is adequate. Abigail kept her head down, spooning the broth into her mouth with trembling hands. She slurped slightly. It was a subtle sound, but in the echoing silence of the room, it was deafening. Arthur winced but said nothing. "Are you warm enough in the East Wing, miss?" Isabella trailed off, realizing she didn't even know her surname. She hadn't asked. She jumped, nearly dropping her spoon. "Smith, your grace." "Yes, your grace. It is very grand." "It is very drafty," Isabella corrected. "Do not let the tapestries fool you. They are mostly there to cover the rot in the paneling." Arthur shot her a warning look. "Isabella." "What? Is it a secret?" "Arthur, the girl is living here. She might as well know the roof leaks over the blue room when it snows. She cut a piece of tough mutton. Have, Mrs. Higgins fetch you another quilt, Miss Smith. We wouldn't want the Duke's investment catching a chill." Abigail flushed, scarlet, her eyes filling with tears. She abruptly stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Excuse me," she whispered, and practically fled the room, her heavy, awkward gait making her look pathetic rather than dramatic. Arthur threw his napkin on the table. "Was that necessary?" "What?" Isabella asked, feigning innocence. "I offered her a blanket." "You are cruel, Isabella. You are punishing her for my sins." "I am not punishing anyone, Arthur. I am simply refusing to pretend this is a holiday party." Isabella set her knife down. "She is a child, Arthur. A terrified child who has no idea what she has stumbled into." "She loves me," he said defensively. Isabella actually laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. "She loves that you aren't a factory boss, and she loves that you bought her hot meals. Do not confuse desperation with devotion." Isabella pushed her plate away, suddenly exhausted. "I have ledgers to balance. Enjoy your mutton." She returned to her study and locked the door. She pulled out the books, but she didn't look at the household accounts. She pulled out the leather-bound ledger at the very bottom of the drawer, the one with a brass clasp. This was her personal ledger. When Isabella married Arthur, her father, a man of trade who had bought his way into the aristocracy with her marriage, had insisted on an ironclad prenup. A portion of her vast dowry was locked in a trust. It paid a quarterly dividend directly to her, intended for her pin money and personal staff. For 5 years, she had quietly funneled 80% of that dividend into Arthur's general estate account to keep them afloat, paying off the butcher, the farrier, and the quiet men who came knocking when Arthur's gambling debts got too high. She flipped to the current year. She looked at the red ink bleeding down the pages of Arthur's accounts. 3 days ago, Isabella had intercepted a letter from the Bank of England. Arthur had leveraged the Westford estate, the actual brick, mortar, and land, against a massive speculation in a South African diamond venture. The venture was a known fraud. It had collapsed 2 weeks ago. Arthur didn't know yet, or if he did, he was ignoring it, hoping the problem would vanish if he didn't look at it. The note was coming due in 30 days. When it did, the creditors would take the house, the lands, the silver, the very Aubusson rugs she had bought. They would take everything. Everything except her protected trust. They. Isabella sat back in her chair. The fire popped, throwing a shower of orange sparks against the iron grate. She thought about Arthur, sitting in the dining room, convincing himself he was a good man for bringing his pregnant mistress to a bankrupt house. She thought of Abigail, crying in a freezing room, carrying a child that would be born into destitution. For 5 years, Isabella had played the good, dutiful, long-suffering Duchess. She had sacrificed her own peace to maintain the illusion of Arthur's grandeur. She had let herself be hollowed out by a man who couldn't even balance his own checkbook. She picked up her pen. She dipped it into the iron gall ink. She didn't feel angry anymore. She felt entirely, perfectly cold. She drew a thick black line through the transfer column. She was done paying for his life. Isabella left for London 3 days later. Arthur barely noticed her departure. He was too busy fussing over Abigail, who had taken to her bed with mysterious pains that the local doctor attributed entirely to nerves. Arthur looked haggard, playing the role of the devoted patriarch, oblivious to the guillotine swinging down toward his neck. "I have business with the dressmaker," Isabella lied smoothly, pulling her gloves on in the foyer. "And I must visit my aunts in Mayfair. I will return by the end of the week." "Take the carriage," he murmured distractedly, looking up the stairs. "Leave word if you see anything nice for the nursery. We need a crib, something in mahogany." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Goodbye, Arthur," she said. The train ride to London was loud and jarring, but Isabella welcomed the mechanical rhythm. It drowned out the thoughts in her head. Her first stop was not a dressmaker. It was the austere, wood-paneled offices of Sterling, Hughes, and Gable, the financiers who managed her father's trust. Mr. Gable was an older man, with spectacles that constantly slid down his nose and a demeanor of polite ruthlessness. He had liked her father. He tolerated Isabella. "Your Grace," he said, rising as she was shown into his office. He smelled of pipe, tobacco, and peppermint. "A surprise. I trust the Duke is well?" "The Duke is a fool, Mr. Gable," Isabella said, taking a seat in the heavy leather chair across from him. She didn't have time for pleasantries. Mr. Gable paused, then slowly sat down, steepling his fingers. "I see. And how may I assist you in mitigating this foolishness?" "I need to sever the financial arteries," she said, "immediately. The quarterly dividends from my trust that I have been directing to the Westford estate accounts. I want them stopped. Rerouted to a private, unlinked account under my maiden name." Gable raised an eyebrow. "That is highly irregular, Your Grace," the Duke may inquire. "The Duke has no legal access to my trust. My father ensured that. I was doing it as a courtesy." Isabella leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Arthur has leveraged the estate on the De Beers offshoot. The fraudulent one." Gable's eyes widened slightly. For a banker, it was the equivalent of a gasp. "Good God, he bought into that. It's completely collapsed. The liquidators are circling as we speak." "I know." Isabella opened her reticule and pulled out a stack of documents, copies of the ledgers, the promissory notes she had found in Arthur's desk, and the bank letters. "I am leaving him, Mr. Gable, but before I do, I need to ensure that when the crash comes, it doesn't take me with it." Gable adjusted his spectacles, pulling the documents toward him. The silence in the room was dense, punctuated only by the crisp rustle of thick paper as he reviewed the disaster of her husband's finances. "He is exposed for nearly £80,000, Gable muttered, shaking his head. "The estate is forfeit. The creditors will seize the liquid assets, the properties, the chattels. Your Grace, if you have any personal jewelry, art, or items of value you purchased with your own trust." "They are already in a lockbox at a different bank," Isabella said flatly. She hadn't spent the last 3 nights sleeping. She had been packing. Gable looked up at her, a glimmer of genuine respect replacing his usual condescension. "You are very thorough, Duchess." "I am a survivor, Mr. Gable. I have spent my marriage bailing water out of a sinking ship. I am simply deciding to step onto a lifeboat." "We will freeze the transfers immediately," he said, taking out a fresh sheet of parchment. "And I will draw up a document of separation of assets for your signature. It will legally detach your ongoing trust income from his debts. But, Your Grace," he hesitated, "when this note defaults, the Duke will face absolute ruin. He could face debtor's prison if the creditors are vindictive." "I am aware. And you are resolved?" Isabella thought of Abigail's chewed fingernails. She thought of Arthur, demanding she house the consequence of his infidelity, while secretly gambling away the roof over their heads. She thought of the 5 years of cold tea, lonely nights, and the crushing weight of trying to fix a man who was fundamentally broken. "Draft the papers, Mr. Gable." Signing her name took 30 seconds. The scratch of the nib on the parchment sounded like a match being struck. When she handed the pen back, her hand wasn't shaking. Isabella spent the next 2 days at a quiet hotel in Mayfair, finalizing her own affairs. She secured a small, elegant townhouse in Bath. She arranged for a skeleton staff. She slept for 14 hours straight, waking up with a sore jaw from grinding her teeth, but her mind was startlingly clear. When she finally returned to the Westford estate, it was late afternoon. The winter sun was already setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow-dusted lawn. The house looked exactly the same, immense, imposing, and decaying. As she walked into the foyer, Arthur emerged from the drawing room. He held a glass of whiskey, and his face was flushed. "You've been gone a long time," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Abigail has been asking for you." "Has she?" Isabella unpinned her hat, handing it to the butler, who looked deeply uncomfortable. "She thinks you hate her," Arthur whined, leaning against the doorframe. "You need to be kinder, Isabella. This stress isn't good for the baby, and frankly, the staff is getting restless. The butcher was here today. He was incredibly rude about the bill. You need to speak to him." Isabella stopped pulling off her gloves. She looked at Arthur. Really looked at him. The arrogant tilt of his chin, the soft jaw, the pathetic, childish expectation that she would simply fix the world for him. "I am not speaking to the butcher, Arthur," Isabella said, her voice eerily calm. "Don't be difficult, Isabella. Just write him a draft from your accounts. We'll sort it out later." Isabella smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It felt stiff and unfamiliar on her face. "No, Arthur, we won't." Arthur did not understand. His brain, so accustomed to the friction-free existence of inherited privilege, simply refused to process the word no. He blinked, a slow, uncomprehending flutter of his pale eyelashes. "Isabella, do not be absurd. It is a butcher's bill. It is £40. "It is £43 and 6 shillings, Isabella corrected, unpinning her cloak and letting it drape over the banister. "And I do not have it. Or rather, I am no longer spending it here." He let out a short, breathy laugh, the sound of a man trying to diffuse a joke he didn't quite grasp. "You are punishing me. I understand. You went to London. You stewed in your anger. And now you are making a point. Fine. Point made. Now write the draft. Mrs. Higgins says there is no roast for Sunday." "Then you will eat oats, Arthur," Isabella said, walking past him toward the stairs. She left him standing in the foyer, his whiskey glass forgotten in his hand, a bewildered statue in a decaying museum. The unraveling of the Westford estate did not happen with a dramatic explosion. It happened with a slow, grinding whimper. Over the next 10 days, the house began to consume itself. It started with the cold. Without Isabella's weekly infusions of cash, the coal merchant refused delivery. The vast, cavernous fireplaces in the drawing rooms sat empty, smelling of old ash and damp soot. They retreated to smaller rooms, bundling in thick woolens. Then came the silence. The staff, possessing a sharp, instinctual understanding of a sinking ship, began to leave. They didn't ask for permission. They simply packed their meager belongings and vanished before dawn. Isabella kept a mental tally as the house grew quieter. The undercook, gone on Tuesday, taking a copper pan as unofficial severance. The footmen, both left by Thursday, leaving the heavy front doors unmanned. The scullery maids vanished over the weekend, leaving a pile of greasy plates congealing in the stone sinks. Only Mrs. Higgins and an elderly groundskeeper remained, bound by loyalty or, more likely, a lack of alternative prospects. Arthur's reaction was a study in profound, paralyzing denial. He stopped leaving the house. He stopped checking the post. He spent his days in his study, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown, drinking whatever cheap port was left in the cellar, and complaining loudly about the draft. He treated the exodus of the staff as a personal betrayal rather than an economic inevitability. And then there was Abigail. Her pregnancy had advanced from a heavy burden to an inescapable reality. Her face was puffy, her ankles swollen over the tops of her cheap leather boots. The cold was brutal on her. She spent hours sitting by the small, smoking fire in the breakfast room, wrapped in 3 blankets, staring at the frost creeping up the window panes. She intercepted Isabella on a Tuesday morning. Isabella was in the library, sorting her personal books from the estate's collection, placing her volumes into a sturdy leather trunk. "Your Grace?" Her voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with an exhaustion that Isabella recognized intimately. She paused, keeping her hand resting on a volume of Keats. The smell of old paper and dust hung in the freezing air between them. "Yes, Abigail." Isabella had finally learned her name, though it felt heavy in her mouth. She shuffled into the room, leaning heavily on the doorframe. She looked terrible. The naive, terrified girl who had arrived weeks ago was gone, replaced by a frightened animal, realizing the trap had closed. "Mrs. Higgins says there is only bread and hard cheese for luncheon," she whispered, rubbing her stomach in a frantic, unconscious, soothing motion. "And Arthur, His Grace, he won't speak to me. He just tells me to stop fussing." She swallowed hard, her pale eyes wide and watery. "I'm so cold. And the baby." Isabella looked at her. Really looked at her. She didn't feel the sharp, satisfying sting of vindication. She didn't feel a triumphant rush of power. She just felt a deep, hollow pity, heavily cut with irritation. "Arthur is not speaking to you because Arthur is a coward," Isabella said quietly, resuming her packing. "He does not look at problems he cannot solve. But he is a duke." She clung to the title as if it were a physical shield. "He said we would be provided for. He said there was money." Isabella stopped. She turned to face her, folding her hands together so Abigail wouldn't see the dusting of dirt on her knuckles. "Abigail, listen to me carefully," Isabella said, dropping the formal, clipped tone she usually used with her. Her voice was low, scraping against the quiet room. "There is no money. The estate is bankrupt. The lands are mortgaged. The only reason this house has had coal or meat for the last 5 years is because I paid for it from my personal accounts. And I have stopped paying." She stared at Isabella, the color draining entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax figure. I don't understand." "He bought into a fraudulent diamond mine," Isabella explained, not sparing her the brutal mechanics of it. "He wagered the roof over our heads, and he lost. The bank will call the debt by Friday. When they do, they will take everything." Her breathing hitched, a wet, rattling sound in the back of her throat. "But the baby, he promised me a nursery. He promised you a fantasy because it made him feel like a powerful man," Isabella said. It was cruel, but it was the truest thing anyone had said in this house for years. "You need to write to your family, or a friend, anyone who can take you in. Because by the end of the week, this house will belong to the creditors." She began to cry. It wasn't a delicate, weeping sort of cry. It was an ugly, guttural, sobbing. She sank against the doorframe, sliding down until she was sitting on the freezing floorboards, her heavy belly resting between her splayed legs. Isabella stood there for a moment, watching her weep for the ruin of a life she hadn't even begun to live. The urge to cross the room, to pull her up, to offer the girl a fraction of her trust fund to disappear, flared hot and bright in Isabella's chest. "No," Isabella thought, grinding her teeth together. "You cannot save everyone. Arthur breaks. She stepped over Abigail's legs and walked out of the library, the sound of her sobbing echoing down the long, empty corridor behind her. The creditors did not send a letter. They sent men. 3 of them arrived on Thursday morning, their boots crunching loudly on the gravel, their dark wool coats smelling of wet soot and cheap cigars. They were led by a Mr. Finch, a man with a clipboard, a piece of yellow chalk, and the tired, relentless efficiency of an undertaker. Isabella met them in the foyer. She was wearing her dark traveling suit, her heavy winter cloak draped over her arm. Her 3 trunks were already sitting by the front door, locked and labeled with her maiden name. "Duchess," Mr. Finch said, touching the brim of his bowler hat. He didn't look impressed by the marble columns. He looked at the water stain spreading across the ceiling plaster. "We are here on behalf of the London Exchange. The promissory note held by His Grace has defaulted." "I am aware, Mr. Finch," Isabella said. "You will find the Duke in his study, the second door on the left. We'll need to begin an inventory of the chattels immediately, Your Grace." "Begin where you like," Isabella said. She pointed to her 3 trunks. "These are my personal effects, bought with my private trust, which was legally separated from the Westford estate last week. The documentation from Hughes and Gable is resting on top of the center trunk. Do not touch them." Mr. Finch glanced at the papers, a flicker of professional respect crossing his weary face. "Understood, ma'am." He signaled his men. They fanned out. Within minutes, the surreal, humiliating process began. They walked through the house, evaluating, cataloging, and marking. A sharp, white chalk X on the mahogany dining table. An X on the grandfather clock. An X on the edge of the Aubusson rug, where Abigail had dripped rain 2 weeks prior. The sound of Arthur's study door flying open slammed through the foyer. He burst out, his dressing gown flapping around his ankles. He looked completely feral. His hair was greasy and standing on end, his eyes bloodshot, his face a mottled, terrifying red. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice cracking on the last syllable. He grabbed one of the younger clerks by the shoulder. "Get your filthy hands off that vase. I am the Duke of Westford." "Arthur," Isabella said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the panic in the room like a blade. He whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto her. He saw her traveling suit. He saw the trunks. He let go of the clerk and stumbled toward her. "Isabella. Isabella." Thank God. The anger evaporated, replaced instantly by the cloying, desperate neediness she despised. He reached out, trying to grab her hands. She stepped back, letting his hands fall to his sides. "They are trying to seize the furniture," he babbled, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature in the hall. "They say the note, the diamond, venture." It was a complete collapse, but it's fine. We just need to pay the margin. Write them a draft, Isabella. Just write the draft, and they will leave. He was panting, his breath smelling sourly of morning port and unbrushed teeth. "I cannot write a draft, Arthur," Isabella said evenly. "I severed the trust." He froze. The silence in the foyer was absolute, save for the scratching of Mr. Finch's pen on his clipboard in the next room. "You... what?" Arthur whispered. "I went to London. I filed the paperwork with Mr. Gable. My accounts are no longer tied to the estate. They are protected under my maiden name." Isabella looked at him, feeling a strange, floating sense of detachment. The man she had spent 5 years agonizing over suddenly looked very small. "I am not paying your debts, Arthur. Not this time." His face went from pale to a dark, furious purple. "You planned this. You knew this was coming, and you hoarded your money while my house falls apart. Your house, Arthur. Isabella corrected, her tone sharpening, the coldness finally cracking to let a sliver of raw, bitter anger bleed through. Your house, your debts, your bad investments, your mistress. I did not plan your ruin. I simply refuse to be buried under it. You are my wife, he screamed, the sound echoing off the marble floors. He lunged forward, not to strike her, but to grab her arms, to physically shake her into submission. Isabella didn't flinch. She just stared at him. The sheer, pathetic violence of his desperation was the final, defining proof of his weakness. Not anymore, Isabella said softly. A heavy, shuffling footstep sounded on the landing above them. They both looked up. Abigail was standing at the top of the grand staircase. She was clutching the banister, her knuckles white, her face a mask of absolute terror. She looked down at the chalk marks on the furniture. She looked at the men in dark coats, taking inventory of the silver. Then, she looked at Arthur. Arthur, she whimpered. Arthur, what is happening? Arthur looked up at her. For a split second, Isabella saw the crushing weight of reality finally break through. His delusion tossed. He looked at the swollen belly of the girl he had dragged into this mess, and he looked at the empty, freezing hall of his repossessed legacy. He had nothing left, no money, no pride, and no wife to clean it up. He let out a sound that was half sob, half groan, and sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying his face in his trembling hands. He didn't answer her. He just sat there and wept. Isabella turned away. The sight of him crying didn't bring her joy. It just made her incredibly, bone-achingly tired. Mr. Finch, Isabella called out, her voice steady. My carriage should be waiting around the back by the kitchens. Would your men be so kind as to load my trunks? I will pay them for their trouble. Of course, Your Grace, Finch said, stepping out of the drawing room. She didn't wait to watch them load the bags. She didn't look back at the staircase. She pulled her gloves on, the leather tight and reassuring against her skin. She walked out the heavy front doors and down the sweeping stone steps. The winter air was viciously cold, biting at her cheeks, but it smelled clean. It smelled like damp earth and pine needles, free of the stale dust and desperation of the house. The carriage was waiting. The driver, a hired man from the village, tipped his hat and opened the door. The interior was dark, smelling of worn leather and cold upholstery. It wasn't the luxurious ducal carriage she was accustomed to, but as she stepped inside and sat on the hard bench, it felt like a sanctuary. She heard the heavy thud of her trunks being strapped to the back. She heard the driver shout to the horses. The carriage lurched forward. Through the small, frosty window, Isabella watched the massive, imposing facade of the Westford estate slide past. She thought of Arthur, crying on the stairs. She thought of Abigail, stranded and terrified, a heavy, complicated knot of guilt and grief twisted in her stomach, pulling tight against her ribs. She hadn't destroyed them. She knew that. But leaving them to drown in the flood Arthur had created was a burden she would carry for a long time. The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel, picking up speed as they hit the main road. The trees blurred into a wall of gray and brown. Isabella leaned her head back against the cold glass. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 5 years, her ledger was clean. And so, Isabella leaves Westford to its ruin, escaping the crushing weight of Arthur's devastating mistakes. What did you think of her final choice? Did she do the right thing by severing the financial anchor, or should she have shown mercy to the terrified mistress left behind? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this dark story of betrayal and cold survival kept you hooked, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more historical dramas.